I really, really appreciate both of these guys doing it. I would describe this probably as a highlight in my career, to be honest, to get to talk to both of these guys. If you don't know who Alex and Steve are, I'm not sure what you've been doing the last 10 years, but just I will give the quick introductions on both of them just to set the table, but I'm fairly sure everybody listening knows who they are. Steve Blank is arguably the guy who's the father of modern entrepreneurship. He wrote the book that certainly shaped how many of the early startups that I led did customer development, 4 Steps to the Epiphany, and then later released the Startups Owner Manual. We have a class like most universities do called Lean Entrepreneurship or Lean Startup. That whole methodology really got defined and catalyzed with Steve's 2013 Harvard Business Review article on the Lean Startup movement. He teaches at Stanford, Columbia, Berkeley, NYU, and also created the NSF Corps program, which is something that we're really excited to have at Carnegie Mellon, and I know a lot of other universities are as well. And then Dr. Alexander Osterwalder, or Alex, is the guy who created the business model canvas and then leads Strategizer. So I think almost every single company that I talk to talks about using the business model canvas. We certainly interact with it all the time at Carnegie Mellon at the Corporate Startup Lab. So I think that's probably what he's most known for, but he's got a bunch of other canvas-like tools as well, the value proposition canvas, the business portfolio map. And then he has the whole consulting and training and tech-enabled service business Strategizer as a way to talk about this. So these guys are really as much of experts as we could bring in. We're about 5 days through the program here, but I wanted to kind of start maybe just stepping up a level, because I think these two can speak to this as well as anybody. And Steve, Alex, either one of you, feel free to start here. But why do you think it's more important than ever to innovate at speed?
Well, I'll let Steve start. I'll let Steve go first.
Unless you've been in Antarctica in the last 9 months, the world's kind of changed pretty radically for almost everybody who breathes, actually.
Yeah.
We've talked about disruption for the last decade or two, about business disruption, about globalization, all those other variables, but obviously COVID-19 has changed the world completely. And so whatever business model you had, in January is obviously completely different now. For most companies, for the worse, and some for the better, but for all different. And given there's a vaccine on the horizon, it's going to change again. And you're going to have to figure out how much of the changes have been temporary, how much are permanent, how much would you like them to be temporary or permanent. And we need antibodies for human beings to react to things coming and changes. We need kind of a methodology to deal with disruption when it happens and to take advantage of it when it happens. And so, Alex, I'll pass it back to you.
Yeah, I mean, if you look at the pandemic now, it's been a disruption that affected everybody. But the reality is that sooner or later, maybe not a disruption this big, but an industry-specific disruption, some technology disruption, will hit any company on the planet, not just companies. And I think Steve can speak to that, any type of organization. So this is just a wake-up call. It is really shaking leaders and saying, hey, this is happening. Happened to everybody now. But if you look at different arenas and industries, this is reality. And I think the type of innovation that companies have always been pretty good at, efficiency innovation, to a certain extent product innovation, is just not enough anymore when the world so radically changes, right? So if you are focused on efficiency innovation, better processes, or just replacing old products with new ones, you're just going to more efficiently die, right? So you really need to start to ask yourself, what is that future that you envision, and start building it today? Because you're not going to build it by just deciding that's the right thing to do. You're going to build it by experimenting a lot, and the best ideas and best teams will emerge. You always have the possibility to acquire as an established organization, but that is getting more and more expensive, so it's not always an option.
Yeah, I think that's exactly right. And I know you guys have been talking a lot about being ambidextrous, right? And the importance of that, right, as part of dealing with this rapid experimentation and the dynamics that we're dealing with. For companies who may be trying to do that, to experiment rapidly, to be ambidextrous, what are some things they should be thinking about?
The first thing I would throw in is, you need to give innovation power. There's no organization today on the planet probably that doesn't have innovation activities. But, with Steve, we like to call this innovation theater.
Yes.
Because it's not really embedded in the organization. And you're not able to kind of build a really serious innovation engine that lives beside the execution engine. It's not that you should forget execution. You still need to manage what you have. But you won't get a really serious innovation engine, this what we call explore, if you don't give innovation power. And that means either the CEO spends at least 50% of his or her time on innovation, or take the model of Ping An, you have a co-CEO who is 100% dedicated to innovation. So without giving innovation power, don't even talk about the ambidextrous organization.
It's probably worth reminding your listeners about that phrase ambidextrous, which I think it was Tushman and O'Reilly who kind of popularized it in the 20th century, which basically said, hey, why don't we build organizations that could both chew gum and walk at the same time? That is, do execution and innovation. And it was a nice theory, and yeah, people read the books, and it was great. But in the 20th century, it wasn't particularly urgent. That is, there was no gun to the head of corporations or government agencies to, well, why do I need to do that? My competitors are peer, other big companies, etc. And we kind of look back at that and kind of go, well, that was the golden age of stupid management. I mean, it was like, you didn't have to be very smart to be a large company CEO. You had to play golf well. But in the 21st century, the skill sets are different. And it's not that CEOs have gotten stupider. It's that the environment has changed so radically. And we kind of go through the checklist, and Alexander does a great job. And I just want to remind your listeners is, China's a competitor. Startups, the idea of startups when I was an entrepreneur of being able to raise more money than a corporation for R&D or even more money than they have in the bank was insane. A startup challenging an existing brand, that was insane. Now brands are ephemeral. You could create a brand on the internet in a year. I mean, we could go through the whole checklist of changes that corporations are now facing. And we use the phrase disruption. And I want to remind your listeners, it's also true for countries. Well, in the U.S., we could afford to have Macy's go out of business, but it's a little worse when your country is being disrupted. And in the U.S., we're finding that's the case in our Department of Defense. We're now the number 2 in a number of areas to China and in some cases Russia. So I just want to set the scene of why ambidextrous is important. And it was a real surprise for me, though Alex, I think, had figured this out much earlier, is that the problem is not, let's have a party and set up an accelerator, and as Alex said, do innovation theater. And I feel kind of guilty of it because that article you mentioned, Why Lean Startup Changes Everything, on the cover of the HBR, gave corporations permission to try to take startup tools without really understanding, and I didn't even understand, that's not the problem in a large corporation trying to do innovation. The large problem in a corporation is organizational design. It's culture and process that you've put in place for execution. People come to work 9 to 5. There's my business card. It's actually an implicit hot link to a job spec. That's what I've trained for, etc. And now you want to take away my power, or very specifically, now there's a new product that's going to conflict with my existing sales channel and my commissions are at risk, or how do I do that? And that's the biggest problem I have found in getting large companies to actually take innovation seriously rather than that phrase innovation theater. If you haven't rearranged your exec staff or rearranged compensation plans or rearranged anything, and your CEO isn't on a different comp plan, then you're not doing innovation. And by the way, the marketplace will take care of that for you because you're going to be a short-term company. Alex, does that make sense to you?
Absolutely. And I'll go back to one of the things you mentioned, which is a big change, big variable change, is that today, I'd say startups are often better funded than corporate ventures. And don't mistake R&D for corporate ventures and innovation, right? R&D is about technology innovation, new science, and it usually helps make the existing business model better. But when we're talking about innovation, it's about new value creation, value for customers, and value for the business. And if you look at innovation teams, not R&D teams, those are separate worlds. They should collaborate, of course, but they're separate things. If you look at the teams in companies, they're rarely as well funded as a subset of the startups out there. So today, I believe the incentives are correct for startups because they're incentivized to grow and scale. Inside most corporations, the incentives are not for these corporate venture teams. They don't get enough money if you don't succeed, or if one out of the 10, 20, or 200 we invest in are not going to succeed, it's over. So the incentives are wrong. The financing is wrong. And I'd say it's not because these companies are stupid. They just haven't understood the innovation that's relevant today well enough. They're
I'd
stuck
say
in
they
the
were
R&D
stupid,
world.
Alex.
They're stuck in the R&D world, and we need to move to an innovation world. R&D may or may not drive innovation. Think Nintendo Wii. It was an inferior product, but came a multi-billion-dollar spitting machine. Is it really profitable with inferior technology? So I don't want to say you don't need technology, but technology innovation is a subset, and it may or may not be the foundation of innovation in your organization. So back to what Steve said, it's all about putting in place the right organizational structures, the right funding, the right KPIs. Otherwise, there's no chance you'll get innovation. And that is the job of the leadership. So innovation is bottom up and top down. Top down, not to pick the ideas. That's the worst thing you could have that comes bottom up. But it's top down to create the conditions for the best teams and the best ideas to emerge.
So if you could deliver like one message to the CEO around this, right? So you got the incentives, you've got the org structure, you've got budgets, you've got KPIs, but you get 20 minutes with the CEO of one of these Fortune 500 companies that's on today. What's the one message you would deliver to them?
What's your comp plan look like? Seriously, I'd be asking, are you being incented by the board for current share price and short-term returns? Then don't do a damn thing. It's the classic prepare an envelope for the next guy and put it in the drawer that says prepare an envelope for the next guy.
Next guy, yeah.
So if you remember, at least in the United States, corporate CEOs are driven by boards who are worried not only about current quarterly earnings and profit, but they're also driven for the largest companies to try to fend off activist investors, i.e. look at what happened to GE and P&G and whatever, for better or worse. And ironically, and here's the big idea, that the best way to kind of an activist investor is to actually innovate rather than and deliver innovation, not deliver innovation theater. But that message, I'm not sure, has really gotten across because someone hasn't made a great economic case for boards that really is better. Because again, most boards are also short-term motivated. The long-term survivors will be those that continually innovate. Apple is a great example, Netflix, etc. Tesla, SpaceX. Tesla versus the auto, a single company puts the entire auto industry, 100 years of expertise, great brand, whatever, back on its heels, and they're all catching up with a startup that almost went out of business. Same with SpaceX, took on a monopoly that whoever thought, boom, it was both technical innovation and business innovation. And you go through the whole list. Netflix, basically, we used to point to Netflix versus Blockbuster. It was Netflix versus the entire Hollywood. Holy cow, who would have thought that? Spending more money making content than all of Hollywood. And so getting boards to understand, and we point to CEOs, but we forget CEOs are an employee of the board of directors. And the board is responsible for overall hiring and firing the person responsible for executing a strategy. And meanwhile, CEOs believe that if I just have an accelerator and coffee cups and mugs that say innovate and posters in the cafeteria, it's kind of like building a cargo cult.
Don't forget jeans and a ping pong table. But yeah, that's what you need for sure, I guess. But should I infer from what you're saying, Steve, because you quickly went to incentives out of kind of the incentives, the org structure, and the KPIs. Do you feel like incentives are the place that companies should start if they're trying to really shift from this incremental to this more transformational innovation?
So I'll give you my answer, but I'm really interested in Alex's as well. My answer is, remember, I'm not talking about individual incentives. I'm talking about, the rationale for the corporation, right? So I'm not talking about, do we goose the CEO's pay to put the thumb on innovation? That's an outcome of having a board level discussion about, okay, are we optimizing short term? And great, we have great market share, great whatever, and I don't really care about what happens in 5 years. We're not going out of business in 5 years. Not on my watch, doesn't matter. Or are we going, holy cow, we want a company around for the next 10 or 15 years? And therefore, what type of incentives and motivations and organizational design do we need to insist that the CEO and exec staff deal with? Are we ready to put up with some of that changes and bumpy transition and try to minimize that? based on best practices that we've seen others do and some of the tools that Alex has built. I want to go, incentives are a kind of an outcome of making probably the toughest high-level strategy decision that a board will make on a public company or even a private company. Alex?
Absolutely. Build on top of that. I go a step further and say, well, even the board is employed by the shareholders. So if you can't convince the shareholders at the end of the day, nothing's going to happen, right? And I was exactly in this situation before the lockdown. I was with one of the biggest global and European financial institutions with the CEO. We had a short amount of time, turned out to be longer because it was very interesting. But he was asking, how can I do this? And, how long does it take? And I said, well, first of all, one question of the board, we answered that one. You need the board behind you. But then, are you really willing to do this? Because it means you are going to probably even change your base of shareholders. And I'll give you an example, not 100% innovation, but transformation. Paul Polman, when he took over Unilever, he did two things. First thing is, he said, we're in it for the long term. We're going to abolish quarterly reporting. Wow, this is a publicly listed company, right? So can you imagine the shareholder reaction? So the second part was then saying, you are with us in the long term. We will create value by really focusing on environmental sustainability and profits in harmony, not one at the expense of the other. We're a business. We need profits. We need to grow profits. But we want to do this by focusing on sustainability. And we can't do this, in quarters. So he had to work really hard to convince shareholders about this long-term story. Now, you could take a Jeff Bezos and make the same case, but that's easier because he is a big owner of the company, still owns today 10% of the shares. For Paul Polman, the work was a lot harder. It's a publicly listed company. He's not the majority owner. He has to convince the market. So you need the board, number one, otherwise you're dead. And number two, you need to convince the market. And no CEO who doesn't understand that will stay in it for very long. And that's a hard job. And if you're just after the money and compensation, probably you're not going to do this because it's a really, really hard thing to do. You need to be extremely passionate. In this case, Paul Polman was passionate about helping save the planet. Other companies like Patagonia do the same. So you need a CEO who's extremely passionate about innovation, but also to a certain extent so naive to actually pull it off, right? That's again, I would say, an entrepreneurial CEO. You need that entrepreneurial spirit, right?
Yep.
Steve can confirm this. Entrepreneurs, they do things because they don't know they can't be done, right? And it's the same for innovation. When you're a publicly listed company, it's really hard, but it can be done. We now have the first examples.
Yeah, that's awesome. I want to pick up on something else, Steve, that you said earlier, and there's some questions in the chat that we'll get to as well. But I wanted to pick up on something you said earlier, Steve, because it's something that's been interesting to us at Carnegie Mellon and the Corporate Startup Lab a lot, which is you mentioned when you wrote the HBR article, all these companies started using the tools, the best practices, the techniques from the startup and applying them inside their companies. And I think this is a great question for both of you as sort of the fathers of most of those tools. Of the tools that are being used in the Lean Startup methodology and generally, like, how much of them do you think work one for one inside a company? And how many of them do you think the tools need to be tweaked for use inside a big, large, established company?
I'll give you my piece, which was the customer development piece, and then I'll let Alex talk about the canvas, though I'll give my little tweak on that. Number one is customer development, this whole idea of get out of the building, build MVPs, blah, blah, blah. The thing that people miss in corporations, particularly if you haven't re-engineered the rest of the organization and you're trying to innovate in an existing company, is that half your customer discovery ought to be done inside the building. What I mean by that is, oh, look, we got product market fit and we're talking to new customers and yeah, this would be a great product. You forgot to talk to the VP of sales.
Yeah.
Because over his or her dead body, are you going to do that? It's channel conflict. And boy, this thing's going to be killed before you even know what happened. Or, gee, you forgot to talk to legal. And because here's a big idea. Startups could do anything. And in fact, let me emphasize anything. The biggest IPOs are all broke the law. Airbnb broke the law. Uber broke the law. Tesla broke the law. And by the way, they never would have been funded in the 20th century. In the 21st century, when venture capitalists said, really, we could have a $10 billion market? What the hell? Hey, we don't know you if you get sued, but have a good time. We'll give you some money for hiring Bradley Tusk or someone else, and good luck. And turns out that's now a model. If there's laws you don't like, well, what the hell? And I say that not glibly because, again, Uber and Airbnb all broke local laws. Tesla in the US broke the laws on having distribution channels outside the existing auto companies. And they consciously said that if we do that, we can make a ton of money. Imagine having that conversation inside of Marriott or Hyatt saying, hey, why don't we rent our rooms to some general counsel, etc. Or tell you, well, here's the phone number of the attorney general of name of our state. They're going to be here in about an hour. So number one is trying to do your own internal customer discovery. And by the way, in a large company, if you're innovating, if you don't know who the saboteur is, it's like playing poker and don't know who the fool at the table is, because then that means that's you. There's almost always a saboteur in a large company because it threatens their power or position or budget or something else. So to answer your question, number one is customer discovery needs to be done inside as well as outside. And by the way, in a large company, you need to preempt all the people who might want to kill this by making them mentors and coaches and whatever. When you're in a startup, everybody's aligned for your success. In a large company, my experience is most people want to strangle innovation in its crib because it's a threat to their day-to-day jobs. And some of them just unconsciously. Hey, it's like a disruption of what I knew what to do. The second part is, and then I'll transition to Alex, is in startups, we took Alex's canvas as is, the classic 9 boxes, and just modified one box, what Alex called customer relationships, which in large companies mean the long-term relationship between the customer and the company. In a startup, we teach it as that box means how do you get, keep, and grow individual demand creation activities. And while we left the box identical, I remember Ann Miraco and I meeting Alex saying, well, we need a 10th box. And it was like somebody telling me I needed 5 steps to the epiphany and realized that I could just simply repurpose one of those boxes. But the other thing that Alex and I and some people in the Defense Department did is we took the business model canvas and made a variant of it for government agencies. And it turns out it works great for nonprofits, called the mission model canvas, that when you don't have revenue, but you have mission achievement or mission success, or when you don't have channels, but you have to deploy products or services. It was a great modification that Alex did that allowed us to kind of use that same model. Alex, over to you.
Yeah, 100%. What Steve just said, and we work a lot with pharma companies, pharmaceuticals. So there, you just can't break the law because you will literally land in jail because you can't just go out and test the way you want to as a startup. And even startups would actually land in jail because it's a heavily regulated environment. The thing I'd add is, do we need to modify the tools? That's kind of the approach. Oh, can we make a Swiss Army knife to do surgery? So it's not about having one tool that does everything. We need several tools to do the job. Now, the big difference with a corporation that's established and with a startup is that a startup is looking for one business model. And until they have that, that's their only concern. When you're in a company, an established company, you actually have a portfolio of business models. So you'll have some startups, some ventures that are looking for one business model. But overall, if you're the leadership, you're actually less concerned about individual business models. You're concerned about your portfolio of business models, those that I'm running and those that I'm inventing. And that was kind of what we realized about 3 years ago together with Eve. I was wondering, could we create a language for that top level for senior leaders, just like we created a language, for business models at the doers level? So what we came up with was this business portfolio map, which allows you to look at that top layer and then ask, are we at risk of disruption because the business models we have are, running out of steam? And do we have a innovation funnel to kind of fill that gap that will exist sooner or later? And what you can see today is those companies that already were thinking about ambidextrous and business model portfolio, they were much better prepared for the pandemic because they could pivot a lot faster. And in that piece, that's where I would say, again, more tools, and tools are not the solution, but they're part. You can't do surgery without a scalpel. But the other piece is culture. You can actually manage, design culture. Sounds pretty abstract. But if you don't, you will never be able to establish an innovation culture, right? So that is extremely important to understand. So there are more things, and if you put those in place, you will succeed. Take Netflix, which Steve mentioned. Why is Netflix better than everybody else? Do they use these tools better? Business model canvas, value proposition canvas or so? Sure. But what they really did, you just got to read the last book from Reed Hastings, No Rules Rule. They built a true innovation culture. Just like Amazon is not better because they have smarter people. All these companies have smart people, but they built a true innovation culture, meaning it's designed into the organizational structure. Back to what Steve said, right? If you want a culture to happen, emerge, you need to design and manage it deliberately. And if you read Hastings' book, or before there was one from Patty McCord on the Netflix culture, you will see it's by design. And I think we still have this conception of innovation. It's just about creative genius. Of course, you need some people who are more driven. Of course, you need people who are better pattern recognition, but they will get killed inside corporations, the antibodies that Steve mentioned, if you don't put in place that system. So I don't believe it's a talent problem. I believe it's a problem of organizational structure and culture, which we need to actively, proactively, and deliberately design.
Yep. And that really builds on a lot of what we talked about yesterday at the forum. We had the CEO of Bank of America, former CEO of Bank of America, say 100% of a CEO's time should go to managing and optimizing the culture. We had some organizational behavior professors talk about that. And people are, I think, in the chat here asking for maybe best practices around optimizing your culture for innovation. Any specific things you would point to just to build on what you were just saying, Alex?
I'd go back to the one thing you need to do first. You need to have a leadership that spends time on innovation. And our friend Rita McGrath, she says, look at the CEO's agenda, literally the calendar, and you will see if they're serious about it, because everybody uses the words. So now I start to call this the Rita McGrath test. Right? Look at the calendar, and if every week 50% is earmarked for activities around innovation, again, not picking ideas, but building the culture, working on the system. Or look at the last 5 leadership meetings. Did they actively work on innovation culture, the system? If you don't see those in the agenda of the last 5 leadership meetings, guess what? Innovation has no power. Because if you have the head of innovation reporting to the person who reports to the person who reports to the person who reports to the CTO and the CMO, nothing's going to happen, right? So for me, number one, you talk organizational culture, you need to talk about power. And it is kind of the org design, org chart part. You get that right, a lot of the other things will happen. Obviously, you need to put the right person in place. It's not just the org chart, it's the people. But if you do that, a lot of the rest will get unlocked almost, I won't say magically because innovation is hard, but it will be a lot easier. If you don't do that, everything else will be a struggle.
Yeah, I love that. Your calendar reflects your priorities.
Let me give you a couple more on top of what Alex said, if that makes sense, John.
Absolutely.
So one is about culture, and literally it's not a memo or posters. And it constantly has to be, for an existing organization, kind of be reinforced multiple times until people actually understand, in both onboarding and training, etc. And the phrase I use is execution pays your salary, but innovation pays your pension. It's a big idea. One's a short-term investment and the others are long-term investment. As that translates, as Alex said, is not only in org chart design, but I remind people, if after you think you have innovation in place, if you have the exact same org chart you had last year and no new people at the table, then you really have innovation theater. I mean, that's the other test. It's not only look at the calendar, look at the org chart, look at the comp plans and whatever. And then the other piece I kind of am now a big believer on is companies miss 2 things. And a simple way to kind of implement this is, number one is you need an innovation pipeline. And what I mean by that is, where do you source innovation from? Is it internal, external? Is it Chesborough's open innovation? Is it you're working with industry? Is it all internal? Is it, by the way, you have an M&A group and they're separate and they're not part of an integrated strategy, or you have a VC group and they don't talk to, it's all siloed? That's just backwards. That's like not innovation. That's, again, power plays about who owns the silo. So number one is, how do you feed this pipeline? And the pipeline could be beginning of discovery, et cetera. Then we have an accelerator, and then maybe the output of the accelerator goes to full stop. Where does it go to? Oh, Well, we haven't figured that out. Oh, that's unbudgeted and unscheduled. Oh, that's a conflict. Oh, it turns out, it's kind of like building the classic highway that ends in the middle of the desert. It's like most people build this, but don't actually have the organizational design. When we keep talking about this, is what happens after things come out.
Yeah.
Well, do we spin them out, or do we change engineering priorities? Are we allowed to have channel conflict, or who decides that? So number one is, what's the organizational design for an end-to-end innovation process? Not a point process, but end-to-end. And then number two is, and this is radical, but it's the only way this works, is if you have what I call Appendix A authorities for innovation. And what I mean by Appendix A is every company kind of has the HR manual, and every company has the finance manual, and then the legal manual. And when you're an innovator, you go, okay, I just want $10,000 to buy X. Oh, you need to go to our approved vendor, or no, you can't go to that conference, or oh no, you can't take those people in your innovation group because those people need to go in by seniority. Well, those are the last people you want, but they're looking through their existing manual for execution. What I call Appendix A authorities is you need them to turn to the back of that manual and go, oh, there are 10 pages here that say if you're in the innovation pipeline, you're allowed to do these different things. And they shouldn't be a battle at every time. They're actually a normal process for the 1% of the company, not 99%. But yes, innovators are different. They need different rules, different tools, different techniques, etc. And if they're never been articulated and never been worked out, everything is a fight every time. And we don't learn from those fights.
I know you've been talking a lot recently about creating an innovation doctrine, which I think kind of feeds into some of this as well. I do want to get to some more questions from the audience, but maybe this is a nice chance to talk a little bit about what's an innovation doctrine. And then I think at least as important, why you need an innovation doctrine.
Yeah. So to me, an innovation doctrine is kind of the operating manual for innovation in large organizations, rather than just using the words. And again, the nice part is senior leadership in military organizations and in corporations are using those words innovation, but there really is no handbook of what is it and why is it. And so number one is it has 4 parts. One starts with context. Do we all agree that we're screwed? Because if we don't agree that we need change, that's a nice way, that we need change. Because if we don't understand that we need change or the magnitude of change we need, then the conversation can't even start. Because to some people, it's like, why are you changing my job title or career or budget or something else? Or in the military, why are you taking away my aircraft carriers? That's what I wanted. And no, those are actually floating bullseyes in the Western Pacific, or in large companies. And once we get everybody kind of aligned about the new circumstances going forward, then we could talk about the role of leadership. Do we have Appendix A authorities? Do we have all these things that we agree on? And do we agree on how we're going to kind of adjudicate between these existing execution processes and the innovation processes? And then step 3 is the one I mentioned, is we need a formal innovation pipeline that goes end to end, that are not individual activities. Key idea. We've confused individual innovation activities with an innovation end-to-end process. For me, innovation is the stuff that delivers new products and services with speed and urgency to customers or warfighters, depending on whether you're in a company or government. And then the 4th part is all these processes and procedures I talked about need to be in place, training and Appendix A authorities and whatever, to support those 3 things above them. That's a doctrine. That's an end-to-end. We thought this through. And with all due respect, you didn't bring McKinsey in to reshuffle the chairs, whatever.
Yep.
This is like a new idea on how do we and by the way, it's not moving 99% of your company around. It's true. Most people will just kind of notice the cultural change, but their jobs for execution will still be in place. But they will understand the role of the crazy people in those other rooms who are betting their jobs and careers because they might be wrong. And in fact, if you remember, I call it a pipeline. It's actually, we know it's actually a funnel. Most of those innovation activities are going to fail. And that's the last piece of culture change, by the way, we didn't mention. In a large corporation, and certainly in the military, failure is not an option. Because if you think about it, in a corporation, if you fail for a known job, I mean, we've been doing this job for years, and here's the spec, and you've been through training and whatever, it's your fault. You failed personally. Get the heck out of my company. This was an execution job. And so failure shouldn't be tolerated on most of those known processes. But inside a company, innovation, most of those things will fail. Well, wait a minute. Our culture says you can't fail. So how do you, in fact, allow failure inside of an execution culture? And in the military, it's even worse. Failure could be life and death on a battlefield. But if you're not innovating in R&D labs, not failing. If you're not failing enough, you're not trying enough, right? We know that as startups.
Well, some of the things gets to Alex's portfolio approach too, right? You want to take a portfolio approach to these things. It makes some of what you're just describing a lot more palatable, Steve, I suspect.
Can I give you an example? Yep. Because I think this is an important part, right? So we looked at kind of the top and the culture, and I think the details actually matter in this, right? And there's a misconception to a certain extent with the whole lean startup movement and sometimes how people perceive customer development. They think you can pivot yourself to success. But actually, it's not about wasting resources. Yeah. You actually need to be really good at killing ideas. In the startup world, that happens naturally because you have follow-up rounds of investments. So some of the teams who don't have evidence, they just get killed because they don't get follow-up investment. In corporations, you need to rethink how you actually invest in ideas. In the execution world, you pick an idea. Let's say we're going to build a new factory for our new technology. That is an execution challenge. You've built factories before, you know how to do it. But you don't know what the next breakthrough business model is going to be. So if you look at early stage venture capital data, you can see that only 1 out of 250 ideas or 4 out of 1,000 will be a breakthrough result. They will give you 50x return on capital. And that's not even revenues, that's valuation. Okay. So think of it. In companies, we'd need at least the ratio of 200 teams working until you get one that is really breakthrough. And companies are starting to do that. So I'll give you one example. Bosch in Germany, this is a big engineering company, 400,000 people. They, over 3 years, invested in 200 teams, but they only give them 3 months. After 3 months, listen, this is the interesting part, 70% of the projects of those 3 months, they're retired. Or we could say killed. Retired is a nice word. They don't get follow-up investment. So only 30% get follow-up investment to go on and continue to test. We're not at execution yet. And again, maybe after 6 months or so, slightly higher amount of money, not a lot. In this case, it's 75% of the teams get retired, right? So only a few make it to the very end. That is a completely different way of working. And it means we're embracing failure. Teams that don't get to the next round, it's okay. You can try again the next time because maybe you were too early, the technology wasn't perfect yet. There are 1,000 reasons why a venture will fail. And it also means we need to think of the other thing, and a counterexample. When you have too much money, you give a team or a project too much money, they're very likely to not succeed because they will maximize the risk of building something nobody wants. And the classic example from right now is Quibi, over $1.7 billion to fund an idea. When you have $1.7 billion, you're not going to go and experiment and test customer demand. You're going to build the thing. So that is the approach that we have in corporations because we're thinking execution, we're expanding the sales force, business plan, trajectories, you can deliver. But in innovation, you don't know. So we need a completely different approach, even how we finance this. And that is where we have the answers. Now it's a question of, are you going to put really the energy, the KPIs, the money where your mouth is, and we're going to build this? Because we have a lot of answers. Innovation is not a black box anymore. It's something now that is really a question of decision and dedication. It's not easy. We have a lot of answers, still hard to do, but you have to start changing those kind of components. Otherwise, you're going to stay stuck with innovation theater. And that over the longer term is a very risky strategy because a lot of companies will disappear because they did not understand how to overcome these innovation myths.
It's probably worth noting the person who asked the culture question actually runs the innovation program for Bosch America, for the North America group, interestingly, Alex. So that was kind of a serendipitous connection. And also, a couple people have messaged me in the app. The Rita that they were mentioning is the same Rita who spoke last year at the forum. She did a talk last year on her Seeing Around Corners book. But yes, that is the same. As it turns out, there aren't two Rita McGraths, or there may be, but this is the same one. Steve, go ahead. Sorry, I didn't mean to cut you off.
So, Sean, let me just add one more thing that just blew me away that I have found in the last couple of years about the difference in innovation in large companies and government agencies and startups. And this one just blew my mind because I spend a lot of time with the innovators who do heroics inside of large corporations. In fact, I'll make two observations. One is we all know the stories of innovators in large organizations, in spite of X, managed to work their way through, and when people said no, and at the end, they're recognized and get some reward. And we've told these stories for 100 years or more, never once recognizing that that's actually a symptom of a broken organization. It's a big idea. Why should innovation be heroics rather than an integral part of the organization? So that's number one. I just want everybody who's listening to kind of go back to your management team and tell senior leadership, we don't want any damn rewards for heroics. We want a process that actually makes it integral to the company. That's one idea. But the corollary to that, and this just blew my mind, and I went back and actually thought about it, and I think it's true. So when you meet these heroes, these individual innovators who actually love being the heroes, it turns out good number, maybe most of them, don't want an innovation process. It turns out there's a type of individual who are incredibly happy to have their ego satisfied, to actually beat the system and not have a process. No, but they don't want to leave and do a startup. They actually get off on, if I could use that expression, of like, oh, I get to work and whatever. And then you go, well, why don't you take everything you've been doing and actually formalize it as a process? And you could just see them getting scared of, oh no, this would take away what I'm special about. And I've actually found that those people actually, surprising to me, are actually one of the detriments to making innovation better in large corporations. Even though as individuals, they actually move the individual ball forward, they're not allies in building an innovation process. Didn't make sense to me until I actually saw it in practice.
Steve, I love that because, if you see companies that still have pirates and rebels and they call them pirates and rebels, know this is innovation theater, right? So, and then people who are proud of calling themselves pirates and rebels, you need to understand that historically pirates and rebels were hunted down and killed, right? So that's not what you want. My colleague Tendai Vicky, he said, well, why don't we call them pirates in the Navy, right? So they still need the behavior of those people who will break down all obstacles, because in innovation there are obstacles besides the organizational obstacles. So pirates in the Navy were those privateers that were actually in the service of a nation to, maybe we don't want to compare innovators to criminals, but they were in the service of the institution. So
I love the idea of privateers, Alex. We ought to call them privateers. That's actually a great phrase. Who was the English privateer? I'm trying to think of his name, but that's Drake. No, it was Drake. Was it Drake? Yeah. We should name them the Drake crew, right? That's a great idea, Alex. Sorry, I interrupted.
And the other thing, what you said, Steve, is that we reward people for those kind of breaking the rules rather than changing the rules. And that's a big idea. That's to emphasize what Steve said. This doesn't work. This is when we still believe innovation is about the creative genius alone. Again, innovators have a different behavior, but you don't want to make it harder for them. You need to create the system for them. And while it sounds so trivial to say create the system, it is about processes. It is about reward systems and KPIs. And that starts to sound boring. So I believe actually there's a generation of innovators that's going to leave this field because it's starting to get a little bit closer to accounting to a certain extent, because we understand how it works. Those who call themselves rebels, they won't be fascinated by this domain anymore, and they will move on to something else. So I do think we're moving towards a professionalization of innovation in corporations today. I think it's a big shift, and I can see that the last 5 years, companies are looking at innovation in a very, very different way, and they don't see it as a black box anymore. They're starting to understand it is about processes. Processes won't stifle innovation. They will actually leverage the human creativity that we have in corporations today.
And I just want to double down. What Alex described is companies will have their own innovation doctrine. That is, they will have a kind of a rule book And it's funny, those who wanted to fight the guerrilla war, often not the ones who want to write the Constitution. And so here we are. Those we're now proposing, I think, both of us, is that it's time to stop fighting these as individual battles, individual what I call point activities, because that really doesn't win in the long term. You get these heroics, but you don't get permanent change to the organization. And that means you're at risk of going out of business.
So if someone wants to create one of these innovation doctrines, Steve, is there a reference you would point them to do that?
Yeah, I'd point them to Alexander Osterwalder, who'd be happy to come into your large company and kind of go do that. I've been threatening to write this book with Pete Newell, and maybe I'll get Alex to kind of help as well. I think this is the next level. And as a startup guy, I never thought I'd be interested in process and whatever. But I think we kind of got the startup thing, if not nailed.
Absolutely.
But it's the corporate thing and the government thing that is clearly, it feels to me a lot like when I looked at startups at the turn of this century, is how I'm feeling about learning about large organizations. And I've been learning a lot. By the way, I have to say, I am blown away that 20 years after I started thinking about customer development and writing the book, it's still a thing. I mean, it's Alex's work and Eric Ries's work, and there's now hundreds or thousands of other books that are standing on our shoulders. But the fact is, holy cow, we might have been right that this was better than what we replaced. And I just have to tell your audience, I'm always smiling every time I think about that, because I was just trying to solve a problem to get my own head around. And then I ran into Alex, and then Eric took up the flag, and boom, we had something that I thought major change and permanent change. And I guess to answer your question, Sean, I think we're about to do it again, either us or someone else, to kind of professionalize these conversations we've been having based on the bad experiments we've run collectively in corporations. Again, that HBR article, it wasn't that the article was brilliant, though Alex helped write it. It was the fact that it gave permission to 7 years of experiments that have gone on that we can now look back and go, well, this didn't work the way we thought. What the heck happened? And so that to circle back to, I think we're ready to codify some of these things in a framework that we could hand the CEO and a board and say, well, here's your choice. We kind of think we know about how to rejigger your organization. Now it's up to you about whether you want to follow this.
It's funny, Steve, like the level of success here, but when I wrote my book, I wrote it for entrepreneurs. And I actually would tell people explicitly, like, I want you not to go work for a big company. And then all these companies started buying the book, and I started spending time with them. And I've become convinced that as much fun as helping create the Lean Entrepreneurship course was 10 years ago at Carnegie Mellon, creating this corporate startup lab where we're trying to do corporate innovation inside these big companies is like, it's a next frontier. And I'm actually convinced personally, there are pockets of innovation that are better suited to companies. And we're unintentionally kind of systematically underinvesting in those and under creating the future in those areas because we've gotten so good at 3 entrepreneurs at Y Combinator and not as good at 3 entrepreneurs that name your Fortune 500. So I think it is. And for what it's worth, I think that Innovation Doctrine book would be remarkable. Not that you need more people telling you to write it sounds like, but I do think that would be absolutely awesome. We've got just a couple of minutes left here. The one question I think that would be great to hit in this last 4 minutes, for the people who are responsible for corporate innovation in their organization, but maybe they're more like a mid-level person in the org, but they've been tasked with doing innovation. What advice would you give them to try to help achieve this transformation we've been talking about the last hour?
So I think the big idea is to realize that most of you, and I don't mean all of you, but most of you are doing innovation activities. And an activity is if you're running an incubator and accelerator and you don't have an end-to-end process on how to deliver stuff through your corporate whatever with speed and urgency, then maybe you ought to start thinking about how do we start putting together the innovation doctrine internally? What are the rules that we need to have? And by the way, these are not pleasant conversations because all of a sudden people's jobs and mindsets need to change. And if you're not willing to do that, then either update your resume or be happy with the accelerator or activities you have. But it doesn't require a fight to have a fight. It requires an education to C-level staff about here's the alternative and here's why and here's the things that need to change. And they're not trivial. Alex?
I think it's always hard, right? When you're not the decision maker convincing others. I don't believe you can convince anybody of anything, but there's a way you can get them to figure it out themselves. So in one instance, we worked with a really, really big corporation, Fortune 100, and we took their risk assessment exercise, which they had annually, and got the executives to work on to destroy their own business model. And it opened up their mind to, wow, we are actually at risk of disruption. And because they did that exercise, it unlocked a lot of energy in the organization. So I don't believe you can convince your leaders if they're not already there, but you can get them there through these kind of exercises. Another aspect would be connect them with other leaders at their level in their types of organization that understand. They will listen to peers, they won't listen to you. And that's what you have to do, is work towards it, understanding you're not the decision maker. And you can't really influence the decision maker other than if you try to get them there through their own way of working.
That's awesome. I do think the budget process too is interesting. We did a lot of work with one of the 3 big telcos in the US just to help them reimagine their budgeting process. And I do think where the companies already have these handles, there's interesting opportunities for you to build on top of it for that kind of forecasting budgeting thing. Okay, we're basically done here, but I think a perfect note to end on is actually from, again, our colleague at Bosch, who spoke earlier at the forum. And she says, and I think this is a great last line, hand it over to you for any final thoughts, but she says she's looking forward to reading The Innovation Doctrine, The Next Frontier in Corporate Innovation. Steve, so you've got more votes for the book, it turns out.
Well, good. I'm looking forward to actually getting my head around writing it. Because the pace of learning that I've gone through in the last year or two has just been amazing. And again, awesome. the COVID changed everybody's view about disruption. And then we'll have whiplash coming out of COVID, where we'll have disruption again. And no one knows how consumer behavior or government behavior is going to be. So for everybody who's stayed on for the hour, thank you. I hope we didn't confuse you completely and gave you some new ideas. And thank you, Sean.
This was awesome. Thank you. Alex, thanks for making the time too. Any final thoughts from you? Okay.
Don't give up. Connect with other peers who've done it, who pulled it off. Learn from others who've made the mistakes so you don't have to make them yourself.
That's awesome. All right. Thanks, guys. I really appreciate it.